Let's have Belinda tame the mic.
This whole theme of radicals has been a challenge for me because I couldn't decide, first of all, what story to tell. Should I tell the story about when I was in high school and I went to camp and we talked about racism, and there was a young woman who stood up, a young white woman who was a teenager, and her parents happened to come into the forum as she was talking, and she talked about her challenges with her African-American boyfriend, and her mother immediately pulled her away and took her away. Should I talk about the first time I cut my hair and went natural, and my grandfather said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" But what should I talk about? And I thought about this whole notion of being radical. And one of the things that came up for me was a friend that I had. She was a really good friend at the time, and her name was Anne. And I met Anne when I worked for Pantheon Books in New York. And I lived on 79th Street, right behind the History Museum. And Anne and I both worked at Pantheon, and we used to share lunch together, and we talked a lot about who we were and where we came from. But we bonded the most around authors. And our favorite author at the time was Castaneda, Carlos Castaneda. And people used to say, "Oh, you know, Anne lives on Sutton Street." Well, I didn't know what the hell that meant. I mean, it was just the name of another street in New York. So it really didn't mean anything to me, magical Sutton Street. I lived on 79th Street, so what? And so one day, Anne said, we were talking about Castaneda, and she said, "You know what? I think I can get some mescaline, peyote." So I said, "Oh, that sounds really good." And she did. She got these two little buttons, these little round things of mescaline peyote, and we were going to take them. And I went home with mine, and that Saturday, I decided I was going to take mine. Without Anne or anybody else, I was going to sit in my apartment and take this mescaline and see what happened. And so I did. And if you know anything about hallucinogenics, you know that you can't sit still and that you have to experience things. And I decided that I was going to go outside on the streets of New York City, which is what I did. And I began to walk. And I started on 79th in Amsterdam, and by the time I got to 125th Street, and I had experienced the beauty of New York, the sun was so bright, and the buildings were gorgeous, and I'd just gotten to the St. Bernard projects, and I said, "Wow, the projects are really neat. Like, what's the problem?" And at the time, there were still phone booths on the streets. So I called Anne. I got on the phone, I called Anne. I said, "Anne, you're not going to believe this, but I took that mescaline, and it was really, really something else. Like, the streets of New York are really great, and they're beautiful, and I love it." And she said, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm on 125th Street in front of the St. Bernard's project." She said, "Don't move. Just stay there." Well, I wasn't going to do that, so I kept walking. And by the time I got to the George Washington Bridge, there was a cab that pulled up next to me, and out gets Anne, and she says, "Get in the car." And I said, "You know, like, what's the problem?" She said, "Just get in the car." So I got in the cab, and she took me to her home, and it was the first time I experienced Sutton Place. I was high, I was hallucinating, and I was about to experience the wealth, the extreme wealth that exists in this country. Because Sutton Place is a place that only millionaires live. And the apartment in which she lived was surrounded by glass windows. And the furniture in there was massive, gorgeous furniture. And I looked at Ann and I said, who the hell are you? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, this is unbelievable. I said, you live here? She said, well, really, it's my parents' apartment. And I said, nah, Ann, this is where you live. She said, yeah, I live here, but my parents don't really live here. I just stay here because they don't stay here, and I live in New York, and so they let me live here. And so at that point in time, my relationship with Ann changed. Not because Ann changed, but because my perception of who she was changed. And I no longer saw Ann as a comrade, as a partner in the struggle of life. And I forgot the stories that we read of Castaneda, who talks about our inculturation of who we are and how we learn to be who we are. How everyone that we come in contact with is a teacher. And the smaller your world is, the smaller your perception of the world is. And your tragedy becomes if you accept that as the only reality that there is in the world. And you don't embrace the stories of all people. When you refuse to be a free radical, that is our tragedy. And that was my tragedy in the loss of someone who was a dear friend, whose story I rejected, who I rejected because of my perception and the narrowness of my own story. And so it's important that we remember that we are all our stories, and our stories aren't the only stories. And we become only larger and larger and fuller when we recognize that this is all an illusion in terms of how we perceive the world and how it was explained to us, that it's not real. It's no real than the one that the person sitting next to you has. So I always want to be a free radical. And I've experienced in these past few days the sorrow of having forgotten a friend who I can't even go back and get at this point because I don't even remember her last name. So being a free radical, able to take in molecules and atoms from wherever you find them and to embrace them and acknowledge that they can be a part of your story and to move with those is the story I want you to leave with, because that's the story I'm trying to live.